Good evening. We're glad to have everyone with us, both here and also online. We thank you for tuning in to us. We're doing a review of Acts chapter 5 for a moment and then get into where we left off last time. Ananias and Sapphira had determined among themselves that they were going to lie about something, and the reason was they wanted to get credit like Barnabas did. You remember Barnabas, he sold a possession and gave it all to the apostles to distribute. Excuse me. And then they went to the apostle Peter and they told him, they said, you know, we sold the land for this much, and here it is. We're giving it. But they lied about how much they sold it for. And the apostle Peter called Ananias down for it, asked him why he lied to God. Well, the long and short of it is he fell down dead. And then here comes Sapphira. And what does she do? She turns around and basically tells the same lie. She was given an opportunity to tell the truth, but she didn't do it. Instead, she was struck dead too. And the same men who carried the one out carried the other out and buried both of them, as the original word is, face to face. And that caused a great stir in the church. In fact, many were afraid of what had happened. And there's an interesting word that we look at, and it's the word them. And that word them, some have attributed it to outsiders of the church, afraid to join themselves to the body of Christ, that something like this might happen to them. Others believe that it was those who might have had tendencies toward being hypocrites who didn't want to join themselves to the fate of Ananias and Sapphira. So the fear came upon all involved, both those outside the church, those inside the church. And we're going to notice in just a few verses something that really happened that was amazing because of these events. In verse 12, we see that many miracles were done by the apostles, and the need for miracles was to prove that the speakers were words, the words they used came from God. They weren't their own. And it should be remembered that miracles have never saved a single soul. Not one. Now, a miracle may save somebody from a physical problem like leprosy or something of that nature, but words never, miracles never saved a soul. Words save souls. Only words save souls through obedience to those words, the words of God. And so Christians were meeting at Solomon's porch. And that brings us to where we start today. In verse 13, the rest durst no man join himself to them, but the people magnified them. Now notice something here. It almost seems like there's a contradiction here. Durst no man join himself to them? What's that talking about? Who is the them in this phrase? It's not speaking about Christians. It's as a whole, it may have indicated some of them, as we've already mentioned. There are two basic ideas about this. The apostles, that is, joining themselves to the apostles. If you're joining yourselves to the apostles, then what? You're joined with Christianity. And we need to point out that you don't join the church. No one can join the church. We're either added to the church by the Lord because we've been in obedience to His will, or we're not added. But we can't just say, hey, I want to be a part of the church. That doesn't work. Our souls must be approved by the Lord Himself. And the idea seems to be, with regard to the apostles, that nobody wanted to, or nobody dared to claim the kind of authority they had, the kind of power that they had. Later on in Acts, we'll see somebody who thought they could take the power, the same power, appropriate the power of the apostles and use it, but those people are going to get beat up, and we'll look at that later. And the other idea basically is they didn't want to join themselves to Ananias and Sapphira, the idea being that they didn't want to be hypocritical as Ananias and Sapphira were, and they would receive the same kind of condemnation. Now, the first idea of who them was seems to be more the answer here, I think, but it's possible both could be in play. But now notice what's then said. But the people magnified them. Now this is why I think that the first them is probably the apostles not wanting to try in any way to take authority from them or claim authority like theirs. But the people who are these people? Was it non-Christians? Was it Christians? The word magnified is interesting. Megaluno, to esteem highly, to extol, loud, celebrate. So if people were magnifying them, they were looking at them as being people who should be highly esteemed, put on a pedestal, so to speak, celebrated. These are people, it appears, that are non-Christians. And maybe Christians too, if again I am right in not joining themselves to the apostles. Now, what would they have been extolling or celebrating or esteeming highly? Well, think about this. If it's talking about non-Christians, then that would be the high standards. They could extol that. They could esteem highly the fact that here are people who have a standard, and they actually believe it, and they practice it. They don't compromise what they teach. They discipline those who act contrary to what is taught. They don't tolerate hypocrites. Christians could be admired because of the pure lives that they live. And think about this. When we live in purity of life, people notice. And if we don't live that life, people notice. And another thing that Christians could be esteemed for in Christianity is that they cared for their own. Not a single Christian was left out. If they had a need, it was taken care of. And that's how we hope that every congregation of the Lord's people do with people. We care about our own. Remember the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians told people to care for everybody, but especially the household of God. We're to take care of our own first, and then the needs of everyone else. And that doesn't mean we can neglect the needs of everyone else. As we have opportunity, as we have the ability, we do for Christians first, and then for non-Christians. And look at their care for the needy. It's similar to what we already noticed about caring for their own, but I don't believe for 1 second that if they saw someone outside the church who needed help, if they had the ability, took care of that need. And then also, what about the healings of the apostles for those that were hurting? We're going to see something really interesting in just a few verses about the apostles and the healing that they did. Now notice in verse 14, and believers were the more added to the church, the believers were the more added to the Lord, multitudes, both of men and women. Holiness coupled with the proclamation of the gospel leads to people becoming Christians. It leads them to the Christ, and that's our job. As Christians, we're to lead people to Christ, not to ourselves, not to some just organization. We're to lead them to Christ. Now, believers comes from an interesting word, pisteo, which signifies a mental persuasion. In other words, they didn't just out of curiosity join. They didn't just for any other reason join. It's because mentally they had examined the truth, and therefore they obeyed the Christ. They became believers, true believers of the Christ. Now, they did not follow instructions because someone expected them to do this, or it was the popular thing to do. Jenny and I were listening to the radio and this country song, and the fellow was talking about if you're going to go to the Church of Christ, you better get there early in order to get a seat. Well, why will some of those people, and I hate to say this, but why would some of those people do that? Some of them will do it simply out of, it's the popular thing. Well, everybody's going there. And that's the wrong way or wrong attitude to do things. Someone else might say, well, you know, Mom and Dad, they expect me to be there, so they're there. Depending on the community, any one of these things could come into play as to why someone would become a, quote, believer. They were required to think. Someone who is a true believer, a believer in Christ, added to Christ, they have to think and they have to reason in order to act according to the Lord's dictates, in order for the Lord to then add them to His body, the church. Now notice the phrase added to the Lord. Again, who did the adding? It wasn't the apostles. It wasn't any of the other Christians. If we applied in this day and time, it wasn't the preacher, it wasn't the elders, it wasn't the deacons, it wasn't by a voice vote of the whole congregation. You know, some denominations do that. They have a vote by some regarding someone who wants to be a part of their group, and they vote on it. And if the majority, or however it is they do this, whether by ballot or whatever it is, says no, that person isn't added to him. But the Bible in Acts 2 and verse 47 tells us that the Lord adds to the church. And it's interesting there when you look at the phraseology, such as were being saved is the original. That's how it translates into our language. Such as were being saved. Who were they added to? Notice the text says, added to the Lord. If you're added to the Lord, you're added to His church. Not by the people in the church again, but by the Lord. You've been added to His body. I want us to notice that they weren't added to a club. They weren't added to a social organization. Even though in some respects the church is a social organization, it's not primarily a social organization. Do we have social benefits from being a part of the Lord's church? Sure we do. We stand around after services many times, and at Jack's I can't get them to go home. Well, that's okay. That's good. I like that. Stand around and talk. We get to know each other that way. But we are not a social organization. We are the church. It's not some kind of fraternal organization like the Masons. The Masons will deny up and down that they are a fraternal organization. They'll deny up and down that they are a church, a religious organization. But their documents, if you get your hands on them, can prove that they do a lot of the same things that a religion does. They have times of prayer. They have times where they sing. They put on religious ceremonies in Christmas time. I remember as a boy, my daddy was a Mason, a 32nd degree Mason. And luckily, I was able to convince him of their religious affiliation. And one day I asked him, I said, Dad, he told me, he said, I have renounced Masonry. And I said, well, Dad, I said, what'd you do with your ring? Because he had this big, massive ring with 4 big diamonds in it. And he said, I took it out in the woods and threw it as far as I could. I thought, wow, that's cool. He could have sold that ring for some good money just for the diamonds and the gold, but he didn't do it. And then I asked him another question. I said, Dad, what did you do with your books? And he said, well, I've still got them. And I said, I want them. And do you know that even though he had renounced masonry, he was still concerned. He said, as long as you cut my name out of them. And so I cut them in a very unusual pattern, took those names, put them in the safe deposit box, and had the books. The Lord's church is not a fraternal organization. It's a bunch of baptized believers striving to obey God. These people didn't join the church, they were added to the church. And the word added is in the imperfect passive. And what that shows is a continuous action. Now think about that. That person was continually being added to the church? No, that's not what it's saying. It's talking about being added to the Lord. These people as a whole who had been added to the Lord, and there were more being continuously added to them. And thus there were multitudes, the text tells us, of both men and women who were continually being added to the Lord. Now, let's think about that for a moment. On the day of Pentecost, approximately 3,000 people obeyed the gospel and were added to them. Added to who? Those who had been baptized under John's baptism, who were then, when the Lord shed his blood for mankind, were the basis of the church. And they were added to them. There were already a good number of these people, but now multitudes are responding to the gospel of Christ. It's absolutely amazing to think about it. Multitudes. How do we think of a multitude? Do we think of it as maybe, say, a congregation of 100 people? Is that a multitude? Or would we think about it something along the lines of the University of Michigan football stadium, where on any given Saturday, 120,000 plus people are gathered? Wouldn't we consider that to be a multitude? And we can see the church growing. The numbers are going to be given to us later. Large numbers of people that were being added to the church through obedience to the Lord. A continuous number of them being added to the Lord. And it also shows that they believed and kept on believing. This wasn't just a momentary thing that was caused by the excitement of what was going on. It shows they believed and they kept on believing. They were truly converted. And I would suggest we would expect that, would we not? I mean, these were Jews who knew the Old Testament law, had been expecting a Messiah, and as it was being pointed out to them how the law had predicted this Messiah, shown the qualifications for the Messiah, and how all of this was going to be fulfilled, when they saw it, they got it. I would also suggest that the leaders of the Sanhedrin knew exactly who Jesus was. Why would I say that? Well, there's a man named Nicodemus. He was one of the rulers, one of the Sanhedrin, who was busy all day with the business of the Sanhedrin. Only had an opportunity to go to Jesus in the evening. And when he did, he made an astounding statement. He said, "We know that thou art come from God." Notice that? He not only included himself, but he spoke we. Who's we? It has to be the members of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and Sadducees who made up that group of people. And when we're added to Christ, we're added to his body, the church which belongs to Jesus. It's often amazed me to think about how the church is portrayed as a body, and in other places it's shown to be parts of the body, and each one of us are parts. Just like a human body has parts, a hand, an arm, leg, toes, feet, heart, on and on the list could go. We're added to the body. And it's interesting to me also when we think about the body that each part has its individual purpose. My thumb has the purpose of being there so that when I try to grip something, I can grip it and make it steady like a hammer. But my feet aren't made that way, unless somebody I know has monkey toes, and they can pick things up, but they can't grab a hammer and hold on to it. We're added to the body, and each member of the body has various roles that they are capable of doing, and we're supposed to do what we are capable of doing. God put all things under his, Christ's, feet, and gave him, Christ, to be the head over all things to the church. What's the church? Which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all.
Where's that found?
Ephesians 5:15. Note also that those who believed were not children. They could think, they could reason correctly. That's all involved in that original word. Young children can neither be believers, nor can they be men and women. Men is used to signify someone of maturity, someone of age. The word women, same way. Look at the effect of Ananias and Sapphira's deaths. Those who were hypocrites, they're certainly not going to join the church, or be added to the church. They don't want any part of this. Well, I'll do this because it's just the popular thing. Hypocrite. I'll do this because, everybody else is doing it. Hypocrite. They don't want to be associated with Ananias and Sapphira. The spoken gospel by Christians caused sincere and honest people to surrender their lives to Christ. And it's not going to be long when they're going to pay a heavy price for being added to the Lord's body. Now let's look at verse 15 and 16. Insomuch that they brought forth the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and couches. What's this all about? Where'd this come from? That at the least the shadow of Peter passing by might overshadow some of them. Why do they want Peter's shadow? There came also a multitude out of the cities round about unto Jerusalem, bringing sick folks and them that were vexed with unclean spirits, watching, and they were healed every one. Notice the result of what's been said in verse 12 is that people are being added to the church. Notice the results are that they recognize that what the apostles had been doing in performing these miracles proved that their words came from God. They were added to the church. Something else happens. Also, we should remember what happened when Peter and John were released. You remember that they went to join themselves with the brethren who were praying on their behalf, and they began praying with this group, and notice what they prayed for. And now, Lord, behold their threatenings. What had happened? Peter and John had been cast into prison. Why? Because they were teaching the people the truth about Jesus, especially the resurrection of Jesus. The leading authorities, the Sadducees, didn't like that, so they locked them up in jail. and they were miraculously released from that jail. So now they're praying, behold their threatenings, and grant unto thy servants that with all boldness they may speak thy word. Now, how were they going to be shown this? By God. By stretching forth thine hand to heal. Notice, the power to heal, where does it come from? When the apostles healed someone, they didn't heal them by their own authority. They healed them by the authority of Christ. They're asking for God to give them the ability to heal people, and that signs and wonders may be done by the name, in the authority of, thy holy child Jesus. All who needed healing had heard about what the apostles were doing in Jerusalem, and they start coming to Jerusalem from outside cities. That doesn't even speak of the ones in Jerusalem who would be coming to be healed. All who needed healing seemed to have been healed. And may I say, I don't think it's just the idea of seem to be. I believe they absolutely, every single one of them were healed, just as the text implies. Do we remember any other time like this? How about the Apostle Paul on the island of Melita? You know, they were shipwrecked, and here they are on the island of Melita, and Publius, the governor of Melita, by the way, that was a Roman governor. We'll get to that later on. But Publius's father had a great fever, and Paul healed him. And the context shows us that in that context, that people from all over the island started coming to be healed. I believe he healed every single one of them. No distinction in the text is made between brethren and those who are not brethren. Anyone who came seeking healing was healed. It's not just Jerusalem, but it's the surrounding cities too. And think about it. Who was brought to the apostles? Well, the sick, got a tumor or something and needed healing. Sick with some kind of disease. But also those that had unclean spirits, demons. Demon possession existed in the first century. But it's interesting that when the miraculous age ended, demon possession also had to end. Why? Well, notice that it took miraculous healing to get a demon out of someone. Couldn't be just done by any old person. It took miraculous ability and power. Wouldn't it have been unfair for God to allow demons to run loose in the world who could take over someone and not have a means to get rid of that demon? And when we look at demons and the possession of demons, as we see them portrayed in the Scriptures, we see that demons could cause a physical manifestation. They could cause a person to act in a certain way. They could cause his body to react in a certain way. Remember in Mark chapter 9 and verse 18, whosoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and he gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. Notice when the demon took this individual, he could cause him to foam at the mouth like a mad dog, to gnash with his teeth. What is that? Well, some people think it just means grinding the teeth, but other people think that it was the idea that he was biting people. And he pineth away, he's wasting away. The context was that a demon did this to this man. And note that there's a difference between sickness and being inhabited by a demon. It was real. It wasn't something made up, manufactured by people who wanted to gain notoriety as it is today. Consider also the shadow of Peter. So that from his body, Peter's, were brought into the sick handkerchiefs or aprons, and the diseases departed from them, and the evil spirits went out of them. Acts 19 and verse 12. Here's a case where if you just took something that was on the body of Peter and you took it to someone who was sick, ill, or with demons, they got rid of them. The person was made well. Remember an account regarding Jesus? This poor woman had this disease for so many years. And she thought within herself, if I can just get to Jesus and just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. The mob was all around Jesus. And when Jesus then stopped, he said, "Who touched me?" You remember his disciples? We would have probably acted the same way. Lord, what do you mean, who touched me? Everybody's touching you. They're all pushing up against you. And what do you mean, who touched me? But he knew that virtue had left him. Well, what's that talking about? It's talking about that woman who touched the hem of his garment and was healed because of her faith. She had absolute faith in Jesus as the most powerful being who has ever walked the face of this earth, that he had the power and he would heal her. And she was healed. And you remember the disciples, again, mocking, and why, what do you mean? Who touched you? Somebody touched me. And this woman knew that he knew who touched him. And she brought it out herself. Me, Lord. In that miraculous age, we see Peter in our present text, his shadow passing over someone healing. Again, in this miraculous age, things taken from his body that he was wearing, taken to the sick or those with demons and being healed. And we see a woman, while Jesus walked the face of this earth, who was healed by touching the hem of his garment. Look at verse 17 and 18. Then the high priest rose up, and all they that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, that is, all that were on his side. The high priest was usually a member of the Sadducean party, and were filled with indignation and laid their hands on the apostles and put them in the common prison. No surprise that the Sadducees, the leading of these people who were persecuting the apostles. It's no surprise at all that now they're leading in the persecution. Why? Because the apostles are preaching the resurrection of Jesus, and the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. Notice something that took place earlier. Miracles proved Jesus was the Messiah. The miracles proved that he could come forth from the grave. And it's interesting that in two different places it says that God raised him up, and in another place it says that Jesus raised himself up. He's God. Notice, rose up. The imagery is almost like someone sitting on a bench or a chair like I am, and they get up. Well, I just can't take this anymore. That's the imagery that's put forth for us. They rose up in their anger. And I want you to notice the tactics of persecution. If you don't like what someone says, what do? Well, the first thing is you're going to shout them down if you can. Pay attention to this. Apply it to today. And if that doesn't work, then threaten them. You keep saying what you're saying, you're going to lose your life. We see this today, don't we? And if that doesn't work, the next step is physical force. Look at what the Sanhedrin is doing. They tried before to quieten them by casting Peter and John in jail. That didn't work. They threatened them, don't you speak in this name anymore. That didn't work. Now they've grabbed all of the apostles and they've thrown them into the common jail. Isn't that interesting? They've cast them into the common prison, the common jail. It would have been very evident to the people around who watched this. It would have been a public display. There was a place where the Sanhedrin especially could lock up prisoners for the night. This wasn't a Roman jail. It wasn't a Roman prison. This was one that was controlled by the Sanhedrin. And the law said that they could not be tried on the same day they were arrested. That was Jewish law. Do we remember a violation, a major violation of that? They arrested Jesus, and in the very same night, they tried him. The Sanhedrin did. They believed that the common prison was a place where the worst of the criminals were put. What were they saying? They were saying, look at here, we've arrested these people and we're putting them in the worst place. That's because they're really bad. Belonging to the people or state or public. The jail. The prison. But notice verse 19 and 20. But the angel of the Lord by night opened the prison doors and brought them forth and said, go stand and speak in the temple to the people all the words of this life. I love this. This is fantastic. It's absolutely amazing. Now notice several things about an angel, a messenger. Obviously a messenger from the throne room of God, heaven itself. An angelic being as we think of them. A heavenly being, not just a human being. Human beings were used as messengers too. Agabus was sent to the Apostle Paul later in the book of Acts as a human messenger delivering a divine message. Paul, bonds are awaiting you in Jerusalem. But this is a heavenly being. In the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord was often a phrase that was used to mean Jesus, but this isn't Jesus who is being sent on this occasion. Later in the book of Acts, we'll see the Lord delivering a message to the Apostle Paul as he is a prisoner in a Roman prison. The doors of the prison were opened. Who opened them? This angel. I want you to think about that. Well, what would have been at the doors of the prison? Guards. And we'll see them later. Did not the Spirit take them away? Sure he did. Opened that door and led them out. I want you to notice they walked out and their marching orders were given to them. Well, what do you want us to do, Lord? Or what does God want us to do? The angel told them, this messenger from God, go stand. Not don't back up and stand firm, and bend over backwards to avoid. No, that's not what he said. He said, go stand. And he wants them to speak. He wants them to talk about the words of this life. Use words. We sometimes, we've got a granddaughter, we sometimes will say, Maya, use your words. He's telling the apostles, use your words. Speak. Don't let persecution silence you. Well, what were they supposed to speak? All the words of this life. What life? The gospel life, the Christian life. Paul said that he held forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Philippians 2 and verse 16. But I want you to notice 1 John 1 verses 1 through 4. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, what was from the beginning? Jesus teaching the apostles, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon with our hands, have handled of the word of life. What are the ways of this life? What are the words of this life? It all revolves around Jesus. Telling people about Jesus, telling people about the law that He gave to mankind. For the life was manifested, and we have seen it, and bear witness, and show unto you that eternal life, which was with the Father, and was manifested unto us. That which we have seen and heard declare we unto you, that ye also may have fellowship with us, and truly our fellowship is with the Father, and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things write we unto you, that your joy may be full. What things did they write? The words of this life. The same thing proclaimed by the apostles where they were told to stand. And where were these words of life to be spoken? At the temple. This just absolutely amazes me. And not that they would do this, but where they are and the rest of the context as to what happens. Where Peter and John had been arrested before, there to go. And that's where they speak these words of life. Where Peter and John had probably been arrested. It's in the backyard of the Sanhedrin. No bubble of protection for those who became Christians. Just because you became a Christian doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer the same kind of ills that other people have, same kind of injuries that they may have, same kinds of pains. But added to that are the slings and arrows of the wicked. Physical things are going to happen to us just because we stub our toes sometimes or hit our finger with a hammer. But added to that are going to be the slings and the arrows of the wicked. As Christians, we're not promised that we won't suffer by the hands of the wicked. It may be physical suffering, maybe just their evil tongues, but we're going to suffer. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Matthew 5:11. Jesus said, just because you're my people, you're going to suffer. I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44. Before all these they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Luke 21:12. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my sayings, they will keep yours also. And that's where we're going to stop for today, and we'll pick up with verse 21 of chapter 5 next week. Thank you for joining us, and we hope and pray that your week will be a good one.